Okay, team. So here we have our myology recorded lecture. So if we think of myo as meaning muscle, ology as the study of, we're going to look at the study of muscle tissue, structure of muscle, and how muscle contracts. So recapping from HAPS semester 1, we have cardiac muscle tissue, we have smooth muscle tissue, which is that contractile tissue within blood vessels and in hollow organs that move things through our body, like our digestive organs. And then we have our skeletal muscle. And primarily, we're going to look at examples of skeletal muscle, so muscle that can contract and shorten to produce movement of the skeleton. Recap pictures of those examples: heart, digestive and blood vessel organs, and then skeletal muscle. So if we think about the functions of muscle, create movement. Muscle uses ATP as the form of energy to produce movement. As a byproduct of using ATP, heat is produced. So muscle produces heat, gives us stability around joints, ability to move from place to place, and posture. If we look at the characteristics of muscle, think about, so what is it about muscle that allows it to do its function? Muscle is excitable, so this is sometimes termed responsiveness. So muscle tissue has the ability to receive and respond to stimulus, specifically electrical stimulus from our nervous system. Contractility, so the muscles have ability to shorten when they're adequately stimulated, so coming together and becoming shorter in length. Muscle produces force through the ability to contract. Extensibility is the muscle's ability to be stretched without being damaged, and elasticity is the muscle's ability to recoil and resume its resting length. So within its structure, and this is outside of the tendon component, there is connective tissue within muscle and structures within the contractile units of muscle that actually provide it with some elastic properties. This stuff will probably be a bit of recap for you. I like to start this with looking at the sentence at the bottom. Attachments is a really good umbrella term for describing where muscles attach to bones. From then, you can describe it as either the origin or the insertion. And there's some sort of details which describe whether an attachment is the origin of a muscle or the insertion. So in terms of origin, it's the tendinous attachment of the bone that is usually more medial or more proximal, so close to the midline or closer to the point of rotation. And it tends to be the larger attachment site or more extensive, spanning more area. During contraction, the origin is generally more stable and moves less than the insertion. The insertion attachment site is the tendinous attachment to bone that is usually more lateral, so away from the midline, and more distal, so further away from the point of rotation. During contraction, it's usually the insertion that moves towards the origin. Some other terminology to describe muscle is the amount of joints that it crosses. So uniarticular, a muscle that crosses one joint, which means it can only create movement of that joint. The deltoid is a good example, from the scapula across to the humerus, so flexion, extension, and abduction of the shoulder. Biarticular is a muscle that crosses two joints. Your hamstrings are a good example of that. So they cross your knee joint and your hip joint, so contribute to knee flexion and hip extension. If we flip onto the anterior side of the leg, your quad muscles, the three medialis, intermedius, and vastus lateralis, are uniarticular, just knee extension across the knee. But your rectus femoris is actually a biarticular, so it crosses the knee joint as a knee extensor, but it also crosses the hip joint and contributes to hip flexion. And then we have multi-articular, so a muscle that crosses three or more joints. The rectus spinae group of muscles, which runs the span of your back, crosses each individual vertebrae and contributes to movements at all of those different joints. Here's a breakdown of what a skeletal muscle looks like, and we covered this a little bit in HAP. One muscle fiber is also called a muscle cell. They are the same thing. That muscle cell is wrapped in a connective tissue called endomysium. A stack of muscle cells wrapped in endomysium, wrapped in what's called perimysium, another type of connective tissue, creates a fascicle, and then a stack of fascicles is wrapped in epimysium and creates a whole muscle belly. Now within that one muscle cell, you then have smaller proteins called myofibrils, which are even smaller again, and they are made up of these contractile units that look a bit like this, called a sarcomere. And a sarcomere is the contractile unit of muscle, meaning it is the structure that allows muscle to shorten and lengthen when it's contracting. And that's quite kind of key to remember, is that a sarcomere is the functional contractile unit of muscle. Types of contractions. So a muscle contracts, a tendon is pulled, or force is applied against that tendon, and the bone will pivot at a joint, and the body part moves. Now, the contractile unit, as we said, is the sarcomere, and this is going to relate to the long answer question within the exam. So make sure you watch a couple of videos. I'll chuck some of those up onto Moodle so that you can see the process of this, what's called the sliding filament mechanism or sliding filament model, happening. But effectively, if we want to look at it as a physical structure that we can create, you put your fingers together like this. In between your fingers, you have these thick filaments called myosin, and then you have these thin filaments called actin, and they act like levers with connection sites that pull those myosin filaments across each other. So when a muscle contracts and shortens, those cross bridges pull and drag those myofilaments together, and then when they are lengthened, they pull apart. And this is an example of one sarcomere, and if you stacked end on end on end on end, you would create one myofibril. A stack of those creates your muscle cell. As I said, I'll put a video up of this because it's really something that needs to be seen as a visual, and it's a little bit hard to see from a still picture and from my explanation. Here is just showing this in a diagram of muscles being relaxed, and then muscle partially contracting, and then fully contracting. In the diagram, you've got this stacked end on end on end. So this is one unit of many, and one unit of many makes a myofibril. One myofibril is one of many that makes one muscle cell. And then you have your muscle cells, which make a fascicle, which then make a bigger muscle. So it's a very small picture here. If we look at the contractile sites, and again, this is the long answer question, so make sure you've watched a couple of videos on this and get the sequence. The thick myofilaments, now the thick proteins that you see here, they have these cross bridges which attach to the thin filaments, which is called the actin. Now there's some chemical stuff that happens here where calcium creates active binding sites for the thick filaments to attach to the thin filaments, but the mechanical structure is the cross bridges, the myosin cross bridges, and the ATP fuels each one of those. So for those cross bridges to attach to the thin actin filaments and to, it's called the power stroke, to do a stroke, and it's a little bit like a stroke of a rower. That ATP fuels each of those strokes, and each stroke will pull those filaments across each other. It costs ATP. There's also some chemical stuff that happens to make these binding sites available, and that's the process. Very, very basically, as I said, I'll reiterate. I'll chuck a couple of videos up that should show this in a visual, which helps a lot more. Okay, so this video here is a really good video at summarizing sliding filament mechanism. And as I said, that's the question is going to be, the long answer question is going to be around understanding this process. So this is a really good video to look at, and I'll let you look at that in your own time, which you'll be able to see in the PowerPoint presentation of this week. Here we have a picture of a motor unit. So the definition of a motor unit is a neuron. So a neuron, remember, is a nerve cell. So it's at the end of the peripheral nerves, and it's a neuron and all of the muscle fibers that neuron stimulates. So a motor unit is a neuron and all of the motor muscle fibers that neuron stimulates. Okay, so one neuron will stimulate more than one muscle cell or muscle fiber. Motor unit is a neuron and all of the muscle cells that it excites. We've also got this thing called contraction type. So contraction doesn't necessarily mean that muscles are shortening. Contraction means that a muscle is producing force, and that's kind of key concept to understand. Is muscle contraction is when a muscle is creating force. So if you might have heard of these before, we've got a concentric contraction, which is when a muscle creates force, but the length of the muscle is shortening. An eccentric contraction is when a muscle is creating force, but it's lengthening. And an isometric contraction is when a muscle is creating force and the length doesn't change. So concentric, there's enough force to create shortening of the muscle. So that's when we produce a movement. And then eccentric is also producing movement, but the muscle is getting longer. So a really good way to think of eccentric contractions is they are like braking contractions. So if I was to throw a ball, and I've got all these anterior muscles creating like horizontal flexion, some internal rotation, to slow that movement down, all the antagonists of these agonists almost has to contract and lengthen to slow the movement down to then create the reverse of that movement. So every kind of concentric movement, when it's finishing, is when agonist muscles will be eccentrically loading, and it's also a way of us being able to generate even more force plyometrically or explosively through eccentric loading to slow a movement down, and then a rapid concentric movement into something like running. So when our foot, if our leg comes up into hip flexion, as that hip flexion starts to slow down, the antagonists of hip flexion, so your hip extensors or your hamstrings and glutes, are going to be eccentrically loaded before they then go into a rapid concentric contraction to then create the extension part of the movements into explosive movements. So really understanding concentric and eccentric, those two contractions between agonists and antagonists across joints is really, really key. So you're always going to have eccentric loading on top of concentric loading between agonists and antagonists. And then isometric contractions are more stability stuff, where you want to limit movements across a joint while other joints are moving. So you've got these contractions happening where sarcomere length, muscle fiber length isn't changing. You'll have some sarcomeres shortening with others not changing shape, but overall the length of the muscle stays the same. This is a way of describing muscles based on muscle fiber arrangement. So we've got triangular shaped muscles where fibers converge into one space. Pec major is a really good example, with a big origin and then the insertion converges into one space, almost like a fan. Circular is fibers that arrange in a circular position, typically found around openings of the body, so like around your eyes and around your mouth. Fusiform is the classic example of narrow tendinous spaces with a wide muscle belly. And then the word pennation describes angle of muscle fibers against the tendon. So unipennate means one muscle fiber, one angle. So diagonal fibers arranged on one side of a long tendon. Bipennate means feather-like or angled fibers diverging from a central tendon, so double. Multipinnate means a group of bipinnate bellies coming together. Then you have strap, which is long, thin belly, generally running parallel, and then flat, which is parallel fibers, and wide flat fibers. So frontalis is the muscle on your forehead. You can also describe muscles based on their roles. So agonists are the prime moving muscles of a particular movement. So if you're looking at a particular joint and describing a movement of that joint, the agonist muscles are the ones that create most of the force during that movement. You can have more than one prime mover, and different joint angles can change how that prime mover is contributing. Synergists are any muscles that assist that prime mover. So if we think about the pec major doing horizontal flexion of the shoulder, your deltoid also crosses the shoulder joint. So it's going to be a synergist muscle of horizontal flexion, but your pec major is doing most of that contraction. So during a bench press or push up, pec major is the prime mover or the agonist. Anterior deltoid of the shoulder is going to be a synergist. Antagonists are the muscles that oppose the agonists. So in this horizontal flexion example, your lats are going to be an antagonist. And if you understand the shape of the deltoid, you'll work out that the posterior fibers of the deltoid are actually going to be antagonists to its very self, or the anterior aspect of the deltoid. So one muscle can even be the agonist and antagonist of itself. And then stabilizers, also called fixators, are the ones that help to limit movement in other joints while other joints are moving. Muscle roles, you've got postural muscles, which respond against gravity, help keep our body upright in posture and fixed positions. They have limited mobility and limited in capacity to bear heavy loads, and they are able to perform over long periods of time. So they're always in a semi-contracted state, whereas phasic muscles are the ones that help our body move through space. They're designed to contract fully and powerfully, so they're the ones that help us move, but they fatigue much quicker. Okay, so if we think about a skeletal muscle, or any muscle, is made up of muscle cells or muscle fibers. These individual fibers within a muscle, or within all of our muscles, have different properties in terms of how they function. And genetically, it's pre-designed as to what proportion of muscle fibers we have. You can train them to function in different ways, but the current set of knowledge is that you can't change your fiber types. So this table here is put into a simple sort of rubric of how muscle fibers work. So we've got slow oxidative muscles, we've got fast oxidative glycolytic muscle fibers, and then we have fast glycolytic muscle fibers. And what this means is we have muscles fibers that are better at using oxygen to produce energy. And if we remember back to our energy system stuff, using oxygen takes a longer time, but we produce lots of energy. Whereas at the other end of the continuum, if we use the glycolytic space, which is breaking down glucose, we can do that really, really quickly and regenerate ATP really fast, but it costs, there's a byproduct of fermenting lactate, which turns into lactic acid, and fermenting pyruvate, which turns into lactic acid, and function starts to get worse. So they're very fatigable. So slow oxidative muscle fibers have a different color when they're looked under a microscope. Myoglobin content, so how much oxygen can be consumed. Capillary density, so how many capillaries actually feed those muscle fibers. Oxidative enzyme content, so how much enzyme content we have that can use oxygen to make ATP. Mitochondria, you remember that that's an organelle within a cell that helps generate ATP using oxygen. Stored lipids, so how much fat we can store within that muscle fiber. Fatigue resistance, glycogen content, which we use to break down to create energy really quickly. glycolytic enzyme content. So enzymes break down glycogen. Myosin ATPase activity, so how we can use ATP to drive our thick filament fibers within sarcomeres, and then size of our fiber diameter, so actual physical size of muscle fibers. So slow oxidative uses oxygen, more fatigue resistant. Fast glycolytic muscle fibers generate force really quickly, but they fatigue really quickly. And then fast oxidative glycolytic are somewhere in the middle. So just have a look through this table at the 3 different fiber types. So we're talking about muscle fibers, and each muscle fiber can function anywhere between being really good at using oxygen to generate ATP and fatigue resistant, to generating ATP really fast without oxygen but being very fatigable, or somewhere in the middle. This is just to show you muscle fiber recruitment. So remember, a motor unit is a neuron, and every muscle fiber that neuron talks to or excites, high amount of force or high amount of intensity, so up by 100%, will help initiate the use of all muscle fiber types, whereas lower intensity is going to be more slow oxidative units. So the more force that is required, the more muscle fiber types that can be recruited. So if you're a person who is really good at endurance, then it's likely that your body is made up of a higher percentage of slower oxidative muscle fibers. If you're a person that can produce a lot of force really quickly, then it's likely that your body is made up of a high percentage of fast glycolytic muscle fibers. And you can see this in elite sport, where you have the best marathon runners in the world and the best or fastest sprinters in the world, different body shapes and different force outputs. They are super highly trained in their field, but also genetically they are geared with the type of muscle fibers that allow either force to be produced over and over again, or force to be high levels of force to be produced really quickly.